The night shift in the intensive care unit began the same way it always did. Fluorescent lights dimmed to a low clinical glow, monitors humming in steady rhythm, the scent of antiseptic heavy in the air. Emily Carter stood at the nurse's station with her hands folded loosely in front of her, listening to the day nurse rush through handoff notes. She was 26, 3 months out of orientation, and still carried the invisible label of new. No one said it directly anymore, but it lingered in the way instructions were repeated to her, in the way senior nurses double-checked her charting. Tonight, her assignment was Bed 7, Admiral Marcus Hale, 58. Multiple rib fractures, pulmonary contusion, official diagnosis, severe traumatic brain injury resulting in unresponsive coma. The crash had made national news for nearly 12 hours before the hospital locked everything down. Now the ICU doors required badge access plus security clearance. 2 armed federal officers stood at the corridor entrance, their posture rigid, eyes scanning everyone who passed. Emily accepted the chart without comment. She had learned quickly that silence earned her more respect than defensiveness. Bed 7 was enclosed in glass walls, blinds half drawn. The ventilator exhaled with mechanical patience. Admiral Hale lay still beneath pressed white sheets, dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, bruising along his cheekbone, fading from deep violet to yellow. He looked less like a wounded commander and more like a man asleep after a long day. Emily stepped inside and closed the glass door gently behind her. She began her assessment the way she always did, methodical, quiet, precise, pupils equal, slightly reactive to light, blood pressure stable. Oxygen saturation strong, ventilator settings unchanged. She spoke each observation softly as she charted, not for his benefit, but because speaking kept her focused. Heart rate 72, respirations controlled. Controlled. That word lingered. Coma patients often drifted in irregular patterns, their bodies untethered from conscious rhythm. Hale's breathing, even under sedation, followed a disciplined cadence. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. Not erratic, not shallow, measured. She adjusted the IV line and felt resistance in his forearm, not rigidity but tension, as if the muscle anticipated touch. She paused, watching his face. Nothing. No fluttering eyelids, no grimace, but his jaw was set too firmly for someone fully unresponsive. Emily continued the neurological exam. She applied pressure along the nail bed. Most patients in deep coma showed either nothing or reflex withdrawal. Hale's hand did not move, yet the muscle beneath her fingers tightened subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though restraining motion. She released the pressure slowly. The monitor's heart rate ticked upward by 2 beats, then settled back down. She glanced at the door. The federal officers remained outside, silhouettes through the frosted glass. The attending physician had made it clear during afternoon rounds. This patient's condition is extremely sensitive. Limit stimulation. Routine checks only. Emily had nodded with the rest. She understood chain of command, but she also understood physiology. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Admiral Hale, I'm going to adjust your ventilator tubing. It was standard procedure to narrate care, even for unconscious patients. When she reached across his chest, she noticed something that had not been documented in the crash summary. The bruising on his right shoulder was linear, not from impact against a steering wheel, more consistent with a restraint strap. She reviewed the trauma notes in her mind. Single vehicle collision, guardrail impact. No mention of extraction restraints. She stepped back and studied his face. There were micro-expressions that did not belong to coma. A faint tightening around the eyes when the overhead speaker announced a security code. A slight swallow when footsteps approached too quickly. Small things, easy to dismiss. The senior nurse, Karen, tapped on the glass and entered without waiting. "How's our VIP?" she asked quietly. Emily kept her tone neutral. "Vital stable. No change in responsiveness." Karen checked the monitor herself, nodding. "Good. Keep it simple tonight. We don't need complications." Her eyes lingered for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring Emily's competence. Then she left. The word complications echoed in Emily's thoughts. She turned back to the bed. "Pain response assessment," she murmured, more to document than to announce. She applied trapezius pressure, a stimulus difficult to ignore even for deeply sedated patients. For a fraction of a second, his breathing paused, not a reflexive hitch, a controlled halt. Then it resumed. Inhale, pause, exhale. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained composed. She checked the sedation drip levels. Within therapeutic range, nothing excessive, nothing that would explain such disciplined autonomic control. She moved to adjust the blanket and noticed his left hand resting palm down. The fingers were relaxed, too perfectly aligned. She gently rotated his wrist. The skin was warm, circulation strong. As she released it, his index finger twitched. Not random, a single contraction, then stillness. She waited. Nothing followed. A coincidence, perhaps. Muscle memory. She told herself not to jump to conclusions. New nurses who imagined patterns where none existed did not last long in critical care. Emily finished her documentation with careful wording. Minimal autonomic fluctuation during stimulation. She avoided speculation. Charts were legal documents. But her mind was not quiet. When the overhead lights dimmed further and the unit settled into nighttime rhythm, she remained beside bed 7 longer than required. She watched the monitors without staring at his face directly. She spoke casually about neutral things, the medication schedule, the time, the change in temperature, observing for response. At 2:13 a.m., one of the federal officers stepped inside briefly to confirm identification numbers on the chart. His voice was firm, authoritative. "Condition unchanged?" he asked. "Unchanged," Emily replied. As the officer's radio crackled with a coded transmission, Hale's heart rate increased again, 5 beats this time, before stabilizing once more. Emily did not look at the monitor immediately. She counted silently to 5. Then she checked. 78. Back to 72. She felt something settle inside her. Not fear, not certainty, but awareness. This was not random neurological chaos. This was control. At 3:40 a.m., she leaned closer to adjust the pillow behind his head. "You're not as unconscious as they think," she said quietly, her tone clinical, not accusing. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden awakening. But beneath her fingertips, along the pulse point at his neck, she felt the faintest tightening. A disciplined body holding its position. Emily straightened and resumed her professional distance. She did not call the attending physician. She did not alert security. She did not document suspicion. She simply observed. And in that quiet room, filled with mechanical breathing and fluorescent shadows, she understood something no one else on the unit seemed willing to consider. Admiral Marcus Hale was not lost in a coma. He was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for, it had nothing to do with recovery. By the next evening, the ICU no longer felt like a hospital ward. It felt like controlled territory. Access points were reduced to a single entrance. Additional federal personnel stood beside the elevators, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Visitor logs were reviewed line by line. Even senior physicians lowered their voices when discussing Bed 7. Emily noticed the shift immediately when she arrived for her shift. Karen handed over the report with unusual brevity. "Security protocols have tightened," she said. "No unnecessary interaction, no deviations from charted procedure." Her eyes held Emily's for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing whether the instruction was understood. Emily nodded once. Understood. Inside the glass enclosure, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Admiral Hale lay in the same position, ventilator breathing with mechanical precision. But now a small camera had been mounted in the upper corner of the room. It was angled toward the bed, not the door, monitoring him, not protecting him. Emily began her assessment slowly, aware of the additional scrutiny. Vitals remained stable. Neurological status officially unchanged. She noted the faint yellowing of bruises, the clean surgical dressings along his ribs. Healing was progressing. Too steadily for someone supposedly in deep neurological shutdown. As she checked his pupils, she spoke in the same neutral tone as always. Light stimulus. The right pupil constricted slightly faster than the left. Within normal variation, but it was consistent. Patterns were emerging. The glass door slid open without warning. A man in a dark suit entered, accompanied by one of the armed officers. He did not introduce himself. He did not wear a badge. "Status, he asked. His voice was controlled, but not medical. Emily kept her posture straight. Stable, no change in responsiveness. The man stepped closer to the bed, studying Hale's face. For a moment, silence pressed heavily against the room. Then he leaned down, speaking near the Admiral's ear. "Sir, we have secured the perimeter. Internal review is underway." Emily watched the monitor without appearing to watch it. Hale's heart rate increased by 3 beats. Blood pressure rose subtly, not dramatic, controlled. The man in the suit stepped back. "As expected," he said quietly to the officer. "As expected." The words lingered. Expected by whom? When they exited, Emily continued her charting with steady hands, but her thoughts sharpened. This was not a passive recovery, it was containment. Later, during rounds, Dr. Patel addressed the nursing team in a closed conference room. "There are ongoing federal concerns surrounding the Admiral's accident," he said carefully. "We are to focus strictly on medical care. Speculation is inappropriate." His gaze briefly settled on Emily, perhaps unintentionally. She maintained eye contact, expression neutral. After the meeting, she approached him privately. "Doctor, may I clarify something about his neurological assessment?" He hesitated, then nodded. Briefly, "His autonomic responses are consistent," she said evenly, "more consistent than I would expect given the reported severity of brain trauma." Dr. Patel's jaw tightened slightly. "Trauma manifests unpredictably." "Yes, sir, but the rhythm—" He cut her off, not harshly, but firmly. "Nurse Carter, I understand you are diligent. Continue to document objective findings. Leave interpretation to neurology." The dismissal was polite, final. Emily returned to bed 7 without argument. Authority in a hospital moved in layers, and she occupied the lowest of them. Inside the room, the Admiral remained motionless. She adjusted his IV pump and leaned close enough that her voice would not carry beyond the glass. "They are tightening control around you," she said softly. No response, but his oxygen saturation dipped for a brief second before correcting. She pretended not to notice. Near midnight, 2 additional officials arrived. Their conversation outside the glass was low but urgent. Words drifted through the door when it opened. Investigation, chain of command, leak. Emily kept her focus on the medication tray, but every sense was alert. When one of the officials stepped inside to examine the chart, she observed Hale's breathing pattern shift, just slightly faster, then deliberately slower, as if compensating. A trained regulation of stress response, not unconscious chaos. She finished administering medication and stepped back, giving the impression of routine. The official leaned over the bed again. "Admiral, if you can hear this, the situation has escalated. We may need to move sooner than planned." Move. Planned. The words were wrong for a medical context. Hale's fingers remained still, but the muscle along his forearm tightened beneath the sheet. Emily saw it clearly this time. Not reflex. Control. After the officials left, the unit settled into uneasy quiet. The security camera's red indicator blinked steadily in the corner. Emily positioned herself where her body partially blocked its angle while she adjusted the ventilator tubing. Her actions were precise, ordinary. Her mind was not. She reviewed every anomaly she had witnessed. The measured breathing, the timed autonomic spikes, the linear bruising inconsistent with the crash report. This was no ordinary patient, and this was no ordinary coma. At 2:47 a.m., the overhead speaker announced a coded alert related to federal security. The words were clipped, procedural. Hale's heart rate rose immediately, 10 beats this time, before gradually descending. Emily placed her fingers lightly against his wrist, feeling the pulse steady beneath her touch. "You are listening," she murmured, barely audible. For the first time, there was the faintest tremor beneath his eyelids. Not enough to be obvious, enough to confirm. The threat was no longer theoretical. Whatever had caused the crash had followed him here. The hospital was not just treating a patient, it was guarding a secret. And Emily, the rookie nurse no one fully trusted yet, now stood inside a closed circle of power she had never asked to enter. She did not know who was being investigated or why the Admiral had chosen silence, but she understood one thing with growing certainty. He was not helpless. He was holding position, and the people tightening security around him were not protecting a victim. They were managing a situation that had not yet finished unfolding. By the third night, Emily stopped asking herself whether she was imagining the pattern. Patterns did not repeat by accident. They repeated because something beneath them was stable. Bed 7 remained physically unchanged. Same ventilator settings, same sedation levels, same controlled stillness beneath white sheets, but the atmosphere around it had shifted again. 2 additional cameras had been installed in the corridor. Transfer paperwork rested in a sealed envelope at the nurse's station, marked pending authorization. No one said the word relocation aloud, but it hovered in every conversation. Emily began her shift with deliberate calm. She washed her hands slowly, reviewed the chart thoroughly, and stepped inside the glass enclosure with the composure of someone who had decided something privately. If she was wrong, she would correct herself. If she was right, she needed proof. Objective, defensible, undeniable. She conducted the neurological exam exactly by protocol. Pupils, reflexes, pain response. No visible deviation, but she no longer relied on what was visible. She relied on timing. She adjusted the IV pump, ensuring sedation levels remained within standard parameters, neither excessive nor insufficient. She checked the camera angle briefly, then positioned herself near the head of the bed, where her body shielded her lips from direct view. Her voice remained professional, even in privacy. "Admiral Hale, I am going to review your medication schedule." She paused, watching the monitor without staring at it. Heart rate steady, 71. Propofol infusion remains within expected range. No change. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her tone by half a degree. Naval Special Warfare Command protocols are very structured. The words were casual, almost academic. The reaction was not. His heart rate rose by 4 beats, then settled with visible control. Emily did not move. She let the silence breathe between them. "Chain of command breaches," she continued, as though reciting policy, often trigger internal review before public disclosure. Blood pressure increased subtly. Not dramatic, measurable. She stepped back and adjusted the ventilator tubing to mask the pause. Her pulse remained steady. She was not provoking him recklessly. She was observing stimulus-response correlation. That was clinical practice. She moved to the medication tray and prepared a saline flush, maintaining routine. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Joint Task Force operations require compartmentalization." His index finger contracted, just once. Controlled, suppressed immediately afterward. Emily felt a cold steadiness settle inside her. This was no longer suspicion. It was confirmation. He was conscious enough to regulate involuntary responses to language tied to his professional identity. No coma patient maintained that degree of control under sedation. She documented vital fluctuations precisely, attributing them to environmental auditory stimuli. It was factual. It did not reveal interpretation. Near midnight, the man in the dark suit returned, accompanied by 2 unfamiliar officials. They remained outside the glass at first, speaking in low, tense tones. Emily pretended to review medication dosages while she listened. "Transfer at 0600, one of them said. "Secure facility, limited personnel." Transfer confirmed. The door opened. The suited man approached the bed again. "Sir," he said quietly, leaning close, "we have reason to believe the crash was engineered. Internal compromise is likely. We cannot protect you here indefinitely." Emily watched the monitor carefully. This time the reaction was stronger. Heart rate spiked 12 beats. Oxygen saturation dipped briefly before correcting. A conscious body absorbing information under restraint. The officials interpreted it differently. "Neurological instability," one murmured. "Sedation adjustment?" Emily stepped forward smoothly. "Vitals are within acceptable variance," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Increasing sedation may depress respiratory function unnecessarily." The suited man studied her for a long second. She met his gaze without challenge. After a pause, he nodded once. "Maintain current levels." They exited. Emily exhaled slowly once the door closed. She had just influenced a decision, small but real. She turned back to the bed. "You heard them," she said softly. "Transfer at 0600. His breathing remained steady. Too steady. "If you are choosing this," she continued, "you understand the risks." Silence. The ventilator sighed. She reached for his wrist again, under the pretense of checking circulation. "I need something objective," she murmured, barely audible. "One response I can document." She straightened, then spoke at normal volume. Routine neurological stimulation. She pressed along the supraorbital ridge, a stimulus difficult to ignore. No visible withdrawal, but when she leaned close and whispered a single phrase, "Operational compromise," his eyelids tremored distinctly. Not random fluttering, directed restraint. She stepped back immediately, restoring professional distance. The evidence was complete. He was not trapped inside neurological darkness. He was holding position under sedation, listening to every word spoken around him. The moral weight of that knowledge pressed against her chest. If she reported it formally, she would trigger an investigation that could spiral beyond her control. If she remained silent, she was participating in something she did not fully understand. At 2:15 a.m., she found herself alone in the unit as security rotated shifts. The corridor fell unusually quiet. She stood at his bedside and spoke in a voice just above silence. "Admiral Hale, if this is strategy, then you know timing matters." Her fingers rested lightly against the pulse at his neck. Steady, disciplined. "But if you wait too long, they will move you somewhere you cannot control." For a long moment, nothing changed. Then, beneath her fingertips, she felt it. A deliberate, measured swallow. Not reflex. Intent. Emily withdrew her hand slowly, her face composed. The test was over. She did not need further confirmation. He was aware. He was calculating. And whatever had happened in that crash had followed him into this room. Outside the glass, preparations for transfer continued quietly. Inside, the Admiral remained motionless, a portrait of vulnerability. But Emily now understood the truth no one else seemed willing to see. This was not a man lost to injury. This was a commander choosing silence as a tactical position, and by confirming it, she had stepped into his strategy whether she meant to or not. At 4:30 a.m., the ICU lights were lowered further in preparation for transfer. The sealed envelope at the nurse's station had been opened. Forms were signed in quiet succession. 2 transport specialists waited near the elevators with a specialized gurney designed for high-security medical movement. Emily stood at the sink washing her hands, feeling the weight of what she knew settle fully into place. If Admiral Hale was transferred while maintaining the illusion of coma, whatever investigation surrounded him would move beyond civilian oversight. She would lose access. Whatever leverage proximity provided would disappear. And if she spoke now, formally, in writing, she would be challenging not only federal authority, but her own chain of command. A rookie nurse questioning the neurological status of a decorated SEAL admiral under federal protection would not be interpreted as diligence. It would be seen as instability. She dried her hands and stepped back into bed 7. The Admiral lay unchanged, ventilator steady, sedation infusion constant. His body was still a portrait of control. She checked his vitals once more. Stable. Predictable. Too predictable. The glass door opened quietly. Dr. Patel entered, his expression tight. "Transfer team will arrive in 30 minutes, he said. "We will maintain current sedation levels to avoid agitation." Emily met his gaze. "Doctor, may I ask, are we certain agitation is neurological?" He studied her carefully. "What are you implying?" The moment stretched thin. She chose her words with precision. His autonomic responses correlate strongly with specific environmental stimuli. That is atypical for deep coma. Dr. Patel exhaled slowly. "Nurse Carter, you are not the first to notice irregularities." The admission was quiet, almost reluctant. "Then why classify him as unresponsive?" she asked. "Because," he replied, lowering his voice, "sometimes the safest place for a conscious man is inside a diagnosis no one challenges." The answer landed heavily. This was not ignorance. It was cooperation. Dr. Patel stepped closer to the bed. "Our role is stabilization, not investigation." He placed a hand briefly on the rail. "You are competent. Do not overextend." He left without further explanation. Emily stood alone again, heart steady but mind sharpened. The decision was no longer about discovery. It was about participation. At 5:02 a.m., raised voices echoed faintly from the hallway, federal officials arguing in low but urgent tones. Words slipped through the glass when the door opened briefly. "Evidence. Internal betrayal. Chain compromised." The Admiral's heart rate climbed rapidly this time. 15 beats. Blood pressure followed. The spike was undeniable. Alarms began to chirp softly. Emily moved immediately, adjusting oxygen flow, checking lines. "Cardiovascular stress response," she called out clinically as security entered. Her movements were calm, efficient. She administered a controlled dose of beta blocker to stabilize the surge without deepening sedation. She did not look at him directly, but she spoke in a tone that cut through the noise. "Admiral, regulate." The word was quiet, almost instinctive. Beneath her hands, his pulse steadied. Breathing returned to disciplined rhythm. The alarms silenced one by one. Security personnel exchanged glances. Neurological fluctuation, one of them muttered. Prepare for immediate transport. The hallway tension thickened. Emily realized the spike had nearly forced an early move. He had reacted emotionally or strategically to whatever he heard. Either way, the risk had increased. As the room cleared momentarily for transport setup, she leaned close to his ear, shielding her mouth from the camera's view. "If you stay silent, they control the timing," she whispered. "If you wake on their schedule, you answer to them." Her hand rested lightly on his forearm. "But if you choose your moment, you shift the ground." Silence pressed in. The ventilator exhaled softly. She felt foolish for speaking so directly, and yet necessary. "I will not expose you," she continued quietly, "but I will not lie if asked directly." It was the line she could live with. She would not betray medical ethics. She would not fabricate unresponsiveness. She would document only what she observed. That was her boundary. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then, slowly, a single tear formed at the outer corner of his closed eye. It did not spill dramatically. It simply gathered and traced a controlled line down his temple. Emily did not react outwardly. She reached for sterile gauze and dabbed it away as though addressing normal moisture. But the message was unmistakable. He had heard her. He understood. The tear was not weakness. It was acknowledgement. Moments later, the transfer team entered fully equipped. Straps were positioned, portable monitors attached. Federal officials stood close, watchful. "On my count," one of the medics said. As they prepared to lift him, an argument erupted just outside the room, sharper this time. "We cannot move him until he signs off. He is unresponsive." That assumption may not hold. The words fractured into overlapping voices. The Admiral's heart rate climbed again, not as sharply, but with restrained intensity. Emily stepped forward once more under the pretense of final assessment. She leaned close, her voice barely audible. "This is your last controlled moment." The ventilator continued its steady rhythm. Then, beneath the chaos of raised voices and shifting equipment, she felt it, his fingers pressing faintly against her palm. Not reflex, not tremor, a deliberate, restrained squeeze. She did not return it. She did not show reaction. She simply straightened and said calmly, "Vitals stabilizing." The room froze for half a second, as if sensing something unseen. The squeeze released. His hand returned to perfect stillness. Emily stepped back, surrendering space to the transport team. She had made her choice. She would not expose him. She would not manipulate sedation. She would not interfere with the transfer. But she had given him clarity. The next move was his. And whatever happened in the next hour would not be shaped by accident or confusion. It would be chosen. The corridor outside the ICU tightened into a narrow channel of authority. Federal officials stood shoulder to shoulder, voices low, expressions rigid. The transport gurney was locked beside the bed. Straps prepared, portable ventilator humming softly. Emily remained at the foot of bed 7, chart in hand, posture neutral. She had returned to stillness, to protocol, to the safety of measurable tasks. Admiral Marcus Hale lay as he had for days, eyes closed, body unmoving, breath measured by machine. But the room no longer felt suspended. It felt like the final seconds before a command is given. "Proceed," one of the officials said. The transport medic stepped forward. Dr. Patel positioned himself near the head of the bed, prepared to supervise airway management. Emily watched the monitors without appearing tense. Heart rate steady, blood pressure controlled, sedation unchanged. As the team began transferring lines to portable units, another suited official entered abruptly, holding a folder thick with documents. "We have confirmation," he said sharply. The crash telemetry was altered. Internal access only. The words sliced through the room. Several heads turned. The Admiral's heart rate rose. 5 beats, then 8. Controlled. Listening. "We cannot move him until we establish clarity," the official continued. "If the compromise is within Naval Command, relocation without statement puts him further at risk." A silence followed. Heavy, calculating. Dr. Patel glanced briefly at the monitors, then at Emily. She held her composure. This was no longer medical uncertainty. It was political fracture. The suited man stepped closer to the bed. "Admiral Hale," he said clearly, voice steady but urgent. "If you can hear this, we require your authorization. The situation has escalated beyond containment." The room seemed to narrow around the bed. Even the ventilator's rhythm felt louder. Emily's eyes remained on the screen. 78, 80, 83. Not panic, decision, the official continued. Sir, remaining unresponsive may no longer serve operational security. The words lingered in the air. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the ventilator registered a shift, an independent breath layered over the machine's cycle. Small, intentional. Dr. Patel froze. Stand by, he said quietly. Emily felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle engagement of neck muscles, the faint tightening beneath the sheets. The Admiral's eyelids fluttered once. Not tremor, not reflex. A controlled attempt. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, Admiral Marcus Hale opened his eyes. There was no dramatic gasp, no violent motion. His gaze focused with disciplined clarity, moving first to the ceiling, then to the suited official, then briefly, almost imperceptibly, to Emily. The monitors reflected stable but elevated vitals, conscious, present. The silence fractured. Sir, the official stepped forward. Can you respond? Hale's lips parted slightly. The ventilator assisted but did not dominate. His voice, when it emerged, was hoarse but unmistakably controlled. Telemetry was altered, he said slowly, each word measured. Access logs restricted to internal command. The room shifted instantly from medical urgency to investigative gravity. Do you authorize secure debriefing prior to transfer? The official asked. Hale's eyes remained steady. No transfer, he replied. Not until internal breach, isolated. Each sentence cost him visible effort. Sweat formed lightly along his brow, but there was no confusion in his expression. Only calculation. Emily stepped forward when his oxygen saturation dipped slightly, adjusting the ventilator support with calm precision. Her hands were steady. She did not look at him longer than necessary. This was clinical response, nothing more. The officials exchanged urgent glances. Orders began forming in clipped phrases. Seal access. Notify command oversight. Suspend transport. The gurney was rolled back. The straps loosened. The plan dissolved in seconds. Hale's gaze shifted once more across the room. It did not linger anywhere. It did not claim attention. When his eyes passed briefly over Emily, there was no visible acknowledgement, no nod, no expression of gratitude, only the faint steadiness of shared understanding. She adjusted his IV line and stepped back into professional distance. Within minutes, the ICU transformed again, not into a transport corridor, but into a secured briefing perimeter. Investigators moved with sharpened focus. Statements were requested, documentation reviewed. Emily provided only what she had charted: vital fluctuations, stabilization measures, observed responses at 5:02 a.m. She did not speculate. She did not dramatize. She did not mention the tear. No one asked whether she suspected awareness earlier, and she did not volunteer it. By mid-morning, Admiral Hale was stabilized under reduced sedation, breathing with minimal ventilator assistance. Federal oversight shifted from containment to inquiry. The crash was no longer treated as accident. It was treated as breach. Emily's shift ended at 7 a.m. like any other. She removed her gloves, sanitized her hands, and completed her final documentation. Karen approached her quietly. You handled that well, she said, tone subdued. Emily nodded once. Vitals responded to stimulus, she replied simply. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room without ceremony. Outside, the early morning light spread evenly across the hospital parking lot. No reporters waited. No one applauded. She drove home in silence. 3 weeks later, Bed 7 held a different patient. The security presence had thinned but not vanished. Official reports described the Admiral's recovery as gradual and controlled. Internal investigations continued quietly beyond public view. Emily worked her shifts as before, methodical, observant, unremarkable. One evening, a sealed envelope waited in her locker. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper. The message was typed, formal, unsigned. Professional discretion under pressure is a rare discipline. It was observed. Nothing more, no signature, no insignia. Emily folded the letter once and placed it back in the envelope. She did not show it to anyone. That night, she returned to the ICU floor, washed her hands, and stepped into another room where another patient required careful attention. The machines hummed. The lights glowed softly. She moved with the same quiet precision she always had. The Admiral would return to command, or he would not. The investigation would expose the breach or bury it. Those outcomes were beyond her authority. What remained within her control was simpler. Observe carefully. Act precisely. Speak only when necessary. In the quiet rhythm of the ICU, she resumed her place, uncelebrated, unannounced, steady. And, somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a commander who had chosen silence at the right moment continued his own work, knowing that in one guarded room, a rookie nurse had seen through the stillness and chosen restraint over recognition.